Well, hello and welcome to a Topher Project. My name is Topher Field and I help people like you to understand the world as it changes around us. And one thing that we love to see here in Australia are people speaking truth to power. But what's quite funny is how often power seems to be afraid of very straightforward, very simple questions. The latest illustration of this has come courtesy of a young man by the name of Barkley McGain, and he joins me now to talk about what he's been doing. Barkley, thank you so much for joining me.
No worries. Thanks, Topher, and hello, viewers.
Now, I was under the perhaps mistaken impression that the idea of a representative democracy was that constituents would have access to their parliamentary representatives. You've been trying to get access to your parliamentary representatives to ask them a relatively simple question, assuming that viewers don't know who you are and haven't seen the videos of what's happened as a result. Can you tell us a little bit about why you're doing this and what question you're asking?
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, what I originally did was I was informed by a friend that there was going to be a Climate 200 event just in my suburb. And as a result, I decided, well, look, I'm going to go and attend and see if they have the answers that I'm passionate about, which is what is the cost going to be of net zero policies? Of course, we know the Teals are all in favour of going all in with renewables, even more so than we have the last 3 years under Anthony Albanese. And I sat there, I endured 2 hours of a 30-minute film basically telling me how evil Gina Reinhart and Peter Dutton are, a 10-minute welcome to country where I really had to hold in my laughter. And then at the end, there was a Q&A. And of course, I had my hand up for the duration of this Q&A. And finally, I was able to ask a question simply about the cost of renewables. And when I wasn't able to get an answer, I was not just staggered, but I was more so angered. The contempt that these people have in the room. I was the youngest person in that room by 20 or 30 years. And I dare say a lot of the people in that room were people who aren't affected by the cost of living. And as a result, they really are champagne socialists in many ways. They, no joke, had champagne flutes that they were clinking throughout the luxury cinema viewing. And of course, Simon Holmes à Court, he's no stranger to anyone in Australia. His family is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And I really think, we really needed a bit of a shake-up in that room. People to realize that, hey, whilst you think that we should be signing on to all these international agreements, signing us up to net zero, particularly in a state like Queensland, which is so heavily dependent on coal royalties, that there should be some consideration for the cost. And for that, I was removed out of the venue. Simon actually hollered out to me, Barkley, don't be a dick. And I thought that was awfully telling, that simply asking a question solely about the cost of these renewables, that I was essentially tossed out. And I suppose, again, it was organic. I found out last week that there was a community forum in Brisbane, and it was being run for the Ryan candidates. So the seat of Ryan is the western suburbs of Brisbane. It's a very marginal seat, and it's currently held by one of the 4 Greens MPs in the country. This is the same Greens who, when they talk about housing being a human right, they're also against, or they're in favour of mass migration, which we know drives up housing prices. They're in favour of subdeveloping land, banning people from subdeveloping their land, as is which ought to be their property right. They're in favour of inheritance taxes. They're in favour of much higher estate taxes and even vacancy levies. And I couldn't believe that at no point when Elizabeth Watson-Brown, the MP for Ryan, a Greens MP that is, the entire time she was going on a diatribe about how we need more social housing, they never mentioned where they want the social housing, and also how we need housing as a human right. It was never mentioned that she owns 3 investment properties, one of which was a multi-million-dollar mansion in Hastings Point. Now, I want it to be clear that, as someone who does believe in freedom and private property, I would never knock someone who does own multiple investment properties. But there's one thing called being a hypocrite. And when you're at a community forum, and it's essentially just became an echo chamber of Elizabeth Watson-Brown and all of her Green supporters who would cheer whenever she said net zero or Palestine or one of these buzzword issues, that there was no kind of back and forth and dialogue on the issues. And again, I was thrown out solely for questioning Elizabeth Watson-Brown. One, I want the cost of renewables would be, which she refused to answer, just like Simon Holmes à Court. And 2, how maybe she should reconcile her own property portfolio before going around saying we need more social housing, and that housing is a human right. So yeah.
Well, it's interesting because as you rightly point out, they're very keen on social housing, but they don't mention where that social housing ought to be. And of course, if you were going to build a block of flats, a high-rise block of flats like what we have as commission housing around Melbourne, in their backyards, they would of course be up in arms. They don't want that eyesore, and they certainly don't want those people around them. They want to be seen to be compassionate. They want to be seen to care, but not actually have to sacrifice anything. You mentioned Simon Holmes à Court there a moment ago. Of course, we've seen this hypocrisy that seems very, very normal, I guess, within the world of the Teals, within the world of the Greens. Are you seeing anyone within those movements, anyone within those meetings who actually seems to be concerned about the costs? Or does it just seem to be across the board, these people really think that they can spend this money, make this energy transition, and that no one should even be thinking about the costs?
Not at all. And I mean, obviously I'm not going to pretend as though I follow Simon Holmes à Court around it. Admittedly, it was only one meeting that I've attended of his. And of course, he's mostly based down in the leafy suburbs of Kooyong, not in where I live in Brisbane. But no, there seems to be no consideration for the cost. And I do think it's because they're out of touch. It's a cliche line, but there can be no phrase that sums them up as well. And the other thing that they have to answer for is, he's bankrolling all of these candidates who claim to be community independents when really they're anything but. They're all singing from the same songbook. And it doesn't really seem as though there's any kind of freedom of thought within these community independents. It seems they're really all on the mantra of, net zero, basically as soon as possible, basically tomorrow, net zero, or even yesterday. And none of them, and they're all about transparency. That's the other issue. They're all about transparency. And I remember, I think it essentially brought down the Morrison government. They wanted to push for an ICAC. And now we fast forward to 2025, and they're the ones kicking people out for asking questions about the cost of renewables. So, look, I think they have a lot to answer for. I'm not someone who, and I think I'd like to, just for all viewers watching, I'd like to differentiate myself from the type of people who glue themselves to the road or throw, tear gas into the air or get up on stage and slam a cream pie in the face of one of our political leaders. I'm someone who simply just wants questions answered. And when they try and fob you off and say, please email the office or please, you can talk about that afterwards. Well, I'm sorry, that's not a good enough response. These people want those answers to be done behind closed doors. They don't want you recording their response, as is my right, to broaden the views of what they say to the general public. And I think it just totally reeks, especially when they're talking about transparency in government.
Barkley, when they talk about transparency, you obviously didn't read the terms and conditions, the little asterisk down the bottom that says for approved questions only. So Barkley, what's next for you? Where does this go from here? You've got a bit of a thing going. You show up at events, you get thrown out by security. Obviously, no questions allowed. That seems to be the theme here. Is this now a campaign of yours? Are you on a crusade, or was that just something that you did and you're going to put that behind you? Where do you go from here, and what might you be hoping to achieve?
Well, I think I'll always be someone who's willing to ask questions. It's not that I come in with a predetermined idea of being tossed out. I mean, my goodness, I'd love to just go to an event and just sit there for the duration and say, wow, that was interesting. But when something doesn't stack up, I'm going to ask a question. And, I think it's really important, even as conservatives, and maybe this is something for viewers to pay attention to, sometimes it's important to get out of an echo chamber. I definitely would often fall into the trap of going to community town halls that I felt like affirmed my political views. But we've got to be very mindful. Anthony Albanese said, I think it was late last week, that he would be more than happy to enter a government with the Greens. And as a result, they are essentially a major party now. And when they're a major party, you can't just ignore them and say, oh, they'll get 1 or 2%, we can ignore them. You kind of have to start to listen and see what these people want to say. You have to look at, their investments and see where that's going and see if they are being hypocrites in the case of Elizabeth Watson-Brown, and really try and take them to task. And that's what I've been trying to do. Again, there's no playbook here. I don't have a calendar that's set out telling me where and when I'm going to be. But essentially, I just think it's important to ask those questions.
Well, Barkley, certainly transparency is meant to be a cornerstone, I should say, of a democratic society. All you're doing is asking questions. And look, I want to reiterate and applaud you. You're not gluing yourself to roads. You're not making a nuisance of yourself. You're showing up to events that are open to the public, and you're trying to ask a question during the designated question time. It couldn't be simpler than that. But obviously, no questions allowed. Transparency only for the questions that have been pre-approved. Barkley, I look forward to seeing where this goes from here. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Topher, and thank you, viewers.